Colonel Charles McGee stood by the window of his quiet home, staring out at the fading light of the day. His military uniform hung neatly on the back of a chair. It had been ironed just an hour ago, every crease sharp, every button polished. The house was still, but his mind was not. He had just received a phone call that filled his heart with both sorrow and a strong sense of duty. A young soldier named Deshaun Carter had been killed overseas during a combat mission. He wasn't just any soldier, he was someone Colonel McGee had personally mentored. Charles remembered the first time he met Deshaun. It was during a training camp 2 years ago. Deshaun had been full of energy, asking questions, eager to prove himself. He reminded Charles of his younger self, hopeful, proud, and brave. Charles was an experienced officer, respected by many. He had served for decades, fought in wars, and earned medals for bravery and leadership. He had seen the worst of war and the best of brotherhood. But nothing ever prepared him for moments like these, when a promising life was cut short, and it fell upon him to bring that young man home. Deshaun's family had requested that Colonel McGee escort their son's body back to their hometown. It wasn't required by the military, but Charles didn't hesitate. He knew the importance of this duty. To him, it wasn't just about rules or procedures. It was about respect, about honor, about showing the world that this young man mattered. He gently picked up the folder lying on the table. Inside were the official travel papers, military documents, and Deshaun's identification. Charles had done this before, many times over the years, but each time felt just as heavy as the first. He packed a small bag, placed his hat on the top, and set an early alarm. The next morning, he arrived at the airport. The sun had barely risen. The air was cool and the city was still half asleep. He wore his full uniform, which made him stand out in the crowd. People glanced at him with curiosity. Some looked with respect, others with confusion. Charles walked calmly to the check-in counter, handed over his ID and travel papers, and explained his purpose. The airline worker at the desk glanced at his documents, barely hiding her surprise. Her eyes flicked from his face to the papers, and then back again. She didn't say much, only typed quickly into her computer. After a few moments, she frowned slightly, as if something didn't add up. "I'm going to need to check with my supervisor," she said, without looking up. Charles nodded politely. He was used to procedures, but something about her tone felt off. He waited silently as she walked away, taking his documents with her. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The line behind him grew longer. Passengers became restless. Finally, the supervisor arrived. He was a middle-aged man with a stiff posture and an expression that seemed permanently bored. He glanced at the papers and then looked at Charles with a mixture of doubt and coldness. "You say you're on official duty?" the supervisor asked. "Yes, I am," Charles replied calmly. "I'm escorting the remains of a fallen soldier. Here are the orders." The supervisor glanced over the papers without much interest. He shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry, sir," he said. "There seems to be an issue with your ticket. I'm afraid you won't be able to board this flight." Charles blinked, confused. "The ticket was arranged through the military. It's all official. There's nothing I can do," the man said, already looking past him. "You'll need to contact your travel office and rebook. Next, please." For a moment, everything stood still. Charles didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply gathered his papers and stepped aside. The other passengers watched but said nothing. Some looked uncomfortable, others avoided eye contact altogether. He found a quiet corner near a window and sat down. He pulled out his phone and called the military travel office. The woman on the other end was polite and helpful. She quickly arranged a new flight, later in the day. He would still make it in time, though it would be close. As he waited, Charles thought about the way he had been treated. He had worn his full uniform, had the correct papers, and was on a mission of the highest respect. And yet, he had been doubted, dismissed, and denied. He had faced this kind of treatment before, throughout his career. As a black man in the military, he had learned long ago that the uniform didn't always protect him from prejudice. He wasn't angry, not outwardly, but inside, something hurt. Not for himself, but for the fallen soldier. For Deshaun. For every young man or woman of color who put on a uniform and still got treated like they didn't belong. The hours passed slowly. Charles finally boarded the later flight. A flight attendant greeted him politely, and some passengers nodded with quiet respect. But no one knew what had happened earlier. No one knew the weight he was carrying. He thought about Deshaun's mother waiting at the airport in their hometown. He thought about how she had cried when he called her, telling her he would bring her son home safely. He thought about how proud she had been that her son served with honor, and now he would make sure that pride remained unbroken. As the plane rose into the sky, Charles looked out the window. The clouds floated by peacefully, unaware of the struggles on the ground. He let out a slow breath, steadying himself. His mission was not just to escort a body. It was to carry a story, a memory, and a message of dignity, no matter how the world responded. Somewhere in the middle of the flight, a woman sitting next to him asked if he was in the military. He nodded. She introduced herself as a retired Army nurse. They began to talk. When she heard his story, her eyes widened with disbelief and sadness. "They denied you boarding?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Yes, but I got here in the end." She looked at him for a long moment. "Do you mind if I share this story? People need to know." Charles paused. He was a private man. He had never liked the spotlight. But he thought of Deshaun again, of the people watching at the airport who had said nothing, of the silence that so often followed injustice. He nodded slowly. "You can share it, if it helps someone speak up next time." The woman opened her phone and began to type. She included no names, just the facts. A black colonel, a fallen soldier, a denied flight, a quiet strength. She posted the story before they landed. Charles didn't know then that the post would be shared thousands of times before the sun went down. He didn't know that his quiet dignity would touch so many hearts. He only knew one thing. When that plane landed, he would walk out with his head high and fulfill the duty he had promised to a grieving family. And that was enough for him. Colonel Charles McGee had arrived at the airport early that morning, ready to fulfill the solemn duty he had promised. He wore his full military uniform with pride, a symbol of years of service, sacrifice, and honor. The folds of his jacket held medals earned through courage, and his posture was straight and steady, reflecting the discipline ingrained in him after decades in the Air Force. He was calm but serious, knowing this trip was not like any other. He was here to escort the remains of Private First Class Deshaun Carter, a young soldier who had given his life in battle. At first everything seemed normal. Charles approached the airline check-in counter with the proper documents in hand. These papers were official orders from the military, authorizing him to travel on this mission. He spoke politely to the airline agent, explaining his purpose. His voice was steady, his tone respectful. He hoped everything would go smoothly. But the airline agent's eyes flicked over the papers with a strange look, something like doubt, mixed with discomfort. She didn't say much at first, but began typing on her computer. Charles noticed the change in her expression. She seemed unsure, uneasy. Moments later, she told him she needed to check with her supervisor. Charles nodded, waiting quietly. What followed was a slow, uncomfortable wait as the agent walked away, leaving Charles standing alone at the counter. Time dragged on, and the people in line behind him began to murmur and glance around. Some looked confused, others annoyed. Charles stayed calm, silently gripping his folder. When the supervisor arrived, Charles could tell immediately that the man's attitude was different. His eyes avoided Charles's gaze, and his tone was dismissive. The supervisor asked questions, That seemed routine but felt like tests. Questions about the ticket, the paperwork, the reason for travel. Charles answered honestly and clearly every time, but the supervisor appeared uninterested. Finally, the supervisor said something that shocked Charles. His ticket was invalid, and he could not board the flight. Charles's heart sank. He calmly explained again that the ticket was arranged by the military, that he was on an official mission to escort the fallen soldier's remains. But the supervisor shook his head, unwilling to change his decision. Charles gathered his papers and stepped aside, his face unreadable but his eyes showing a quiet pain. Around him passengers watched but said nothing. No one offered help or support. The silence was heavy. For a moment Charles felt a flood of emotions: hurt, disbelief, and frustration. But he did not let them show. He knew that sometimes, even in uniform, people would see him first as a black man and second as an officer. He had experienced discrimination throughout his career, and this was just another painful reminder. He thought about Deshaun, the young soldier who had dreamed of serving his country with honor, but now lay far away, wrapped in a flag, waiting to be brought home. Charles reminded himself that he was not just fighting for himself, but for every soldier who deserved dignity, in death as well as life. He moved to a quiet corner of the airport and called the military travel office. A woman on the other end listened carefully and quickly arranged a new flight for later in the day. Charles thanked her and sat back down, waiting for the next opportunity. During those long hours, his mind wandered to the unfairness of the situation. Here he was, a decorated officer wearing his uniform with pride, and yet he was treated like a problem, like someone who didn't belong. It was a painful contradiction. The very symbol of his sacrifice became the cause of his rejection. Charles noticed how other travelers avoided looking at him. Some stared but quickly looked away. A few whispered in small groups. He felt invisible in the crowd, not because he wanted to be, but because the world around him refused to see him as he truly was. When the time finally came, Charles boarded the new flight. The flight attendants greeted him with polite smiles, and a few passengers nodded in quiet respect. But no one spoke of what had happened earlier. On the plane, a woman sitting next to Charles introduced herself as a retired Army nurse. When she heard his story, she was shocked and saddened. "How could they deny you boarding?" she asked softly. Charles explained calmly, sharing the details but avoiding bitterness. She asked if she could share the story on social media. Charles hesitated but then agreed. He wanted people to understand that this kind of treatment was not just about one incident, it was part of a larger problem. The woman took out her phone and quickly wrote the post, describing the dignity of the colonel, the pain of losing a young soldier, and the injustice of being denied. The post spread quickly, reaching thousands of people by the time the plane landed. Meanwhile, Charles thought about the family waiting for him. He knew Deshaun's mother would be heartbroken, but also proud that her son's remains would be escorted by someone who cared deeply. The weight of responsibility was heavy on his shoulders, but he carried it with quiet strength. When the plane touched down, Charles stepped off with his head held high. The journey had been difficult, but his mission remained clear. He would ensure that Deshaun's sacrifice was honored, and that his memory would live on. This experience left a lasting impression on Charles. It was a reminder that, even in service, battles were fought not only on distant fields, but also in everyday moments. His story was one of courage, dignity, and resilience in the face of injustice, and it was just beginning. Colonel Charles McGee had finally managed to board a later flight after being denied earlier. Though delayed, his determination to fulfill his promise of escorting Private First Class Deshaun Carter's remains home was stronger than ever. The hours of waiting and the painful rejection at the gate had not broken his spirit. Instead, they fueled a quiet fire inside him, a resolve to honor his fallen comrade no matter what. As the plane took off, Charles settled into his seat. the uniform, still crisp, the metals catching the soft light from the window. He looked around the cabin quietly. Most passengers were absorbed in their own worlds, reading, chatting softly, or watching the safety video. But a few stole glances at the solemn man in uniform. To them, he seemed like a figure of dignity, someone carrying a heavy burden with strength and grace. Sitting next to him was a woman who introduced herself as a retired Army nurse named Karen. She had served for many years, caring for wounded soldiers and witnessing the true cost of war. When Charles explained why he was traveling, his role escorting the remains of a fallen soldier, Karen's eyes widened. Her voice lowered as she said, "That's an honor, Colonel, but to be denied boarding? That's unacceptable." Charles nodded, but did not speak much. He was used to facing challenges, both on and off the battlefield. As their conversation continued, Karen asked if Charles would allow her to share his story on social media. At first, Charles hesitated. He had always been a private person, preferring to keep personal struggles out of the public eye. But then he thought about Deshawn's mother, the young soldier whose life was taken too soon, and about all those who had faced discrimination silently. "If it helps people understand and maybe change things," he said quietly, "then yes, you may share it." Karen pulled out her phone and typed carefully. Today, a black colonel in full uniform was denied boarding while escorting the remains of a fallen soldier. This is not just about one man. It's about respect, honor, and the struggles many faced despite their service. She posted it immediately. What Charles didn't realize was that the post would spread rapidly across social media platforms. Veterans groups, civil rights organizations, and ordinary citizens began sharing the story. Comments poured in, some expressing outrage, others sharing similar experiences of discrimination. The hashtag Honor Colonel McGee began to trend, sparking conversations about racial bias in the military and civilian life. Meanwhile, back at the airline headquarters, news of the incident had reached the executives. They were unprepared for the wave of public anger. Journalists called for statements, and veteran advocacy groups demanded answers. The airline issued a brief apology, but it was vague and impersonal, saying only that they regretted the inconvenience caused. Colonel McGee, however, did not seek publicity. He focused on his mission. Upon landing, he was greeted by representatives from the military and the family of the fallen soldier. The atmosphere was heavy with sorrow, but also filled with respect. Charles held the mother's hand tightly as they approached the flag-draped casket. The contrast between the cold rejection at the airport and this moment of deep honor was sharp. Charles felt the weight of his responsibility, but also the strength of his resolve. He had been denied earlier, but he refused to let bitterness cloud this final act of respect for a brave young man. As days passed, the story continued to gain attention. Veterans spoke out, sharing stories of their own encounters with discrimination. Many black service members described being questioned about their credentials, ignored, or treated unfairly despite their uniforms and sacrifices. The incident became a symbol of a larger problem: how even those who serve their country with distinction are not immune to prejudice. Civil rights leaders called for change, urging the military and civilian institutions to address racial bias more seriously. The story of Colonel McGee became a rallying point, a reminder that honor must be shown to all who serve, regardless of color. In the quiet moments after the ceremonies, Charles reflected on the journey. He thought about the young soldier he had escorted home and about the families who had lost loved ones. He knew the fight for equality was far from over, but he also knew that by standing firm in dignity and grace, he was helping to move the world forward. One evening, he agreed to a televised interview, not to seek fame, but to speak on behalf of those who could not. When asked about the denial at the airport, Charles answered calmly, "This was not just about me. It was about respect for every soldier, every family, and every human being. I hope that sharing my experience helps others understand the importance of fairness and honor. His words resonated deeply with viewers. Many veterans and civilians alike reached out to thank him for his courage. The interview brought attention not only to racial bias, but also to the strength of those who endure it with dignity. Through this experience, Colonel McGee became more than a soldier. He became a symbol of resilience, respect, and hope. His quiet strength in the face of injustice inspired many to speak up and demand change. As the world watched, the story of the black colonel denied his flight, while escorting a fallen soldier's remains became a powerful lesson about the need for honor, fairness, and understanding in every part of society. It was a reminder that true courage is not only shown on the battlefield but also in standing up for what is right, even when the odds are against you. Colonel Charles McGee's story began to spread far and wide, capturing the hearts and minds of many people across the country. What had started as a painful moment at an airport turned into a powerful message about respect, honor, and the ongoing fight against unfair treatment. But for Charles, the journey was not over yet. The real work, the mission to honor the fallen soldier and to bring about change, was just beginning. After the interview and the social media attention, Charles was contacted by many organizations. Veterans groups reached out to thank him and invited him to speak at events. Civil rights leaders wanted to meet him to discuss ways to address discrimination in the military and beyond. Even some government officials asked to hear his story. Charles was surprised by how much attention his quiet actions had drawn. He had only wanted to do his duty, but now he realized that duty had grown much larger. At the same time, Charles continued with the deeply personal and solemn task of supporting the family of Private First Class Deshaun Carter. He had grown close to Deshaun's mother and siblings. They shared stories about Deshaun's dreams, his courage, and the joy he brought to their lives. Charles saw how much they were hurting, and he knew his presence gave them comfort. It was not just about military honors. It was about human connection, empathy, and healing. One afternoon, Charles visited the small town where Deshaun had grown up. The streets were quiet, lined with houses that looked well lived in but worn by time. At the local community center, a gathering was held in Deshaun's memory. Friends, neighbors, and family came together to share memories and celebrate his life. Charles was invited to speak. He stood before the crowd, dressed in his uniform, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. But as he spoke, his voice was steady and full of warmth. He told the story of Deshaun's bravery, his kindness, and the importance of honoring every soldier, no matter their background. The crowd listened intently, some wiping tears away, others nodding in agreement. Afterward, many came up to Charles to thank him. A few shared their own stories of discrimination. Others simply expressed gratitude for his service. Charles realized how much these moments meant, not just for the family, but for the entire community. He was reminded again that respect and honor were not just ceremonies or medals. They were lived experiences felt deeply by all. Meanwhile, the airline company that had initially denied Charles boarding faced increasing pressure. Customer complaints, media stories, and social media posts forced them to reevaluate their policies. The company promised to conduct training for their staff to recognize and prevent racial bias. They also agreed to meet with veterans groups to listen and learn. Charles was invited to participate in some of these discussions, not as a speaker, but as someone who could share real-life experiences and insights. Though these steps were small, Charles saw them as important progress. Change often began with difficult conversations, with people willing to face uncomfortable truths and work toward a better future. His own experience had sparked those conversations, and he was determined to keep pushing forward. At home, Charles reflected on his long career. He thought about the many battles he had fought, some on distant lands, others in the quiet moments of life. He remembered the times he had faced unfair treatment but continued to stand tall, not out of anger but out of a belief in something greater. the hope that respect and fairness would one day be the norm, not the exception. One evening, Charles received a letter from Deshawn's mother. It was simple, but heartfelt. She thanked him for being there when she needed someone most. She said that knowing Charles had escorted her son's remains gave her peace. That letter meant more to Charles than any award or recognition. The story also reached young people. Schools invited Charles to speak to students about service, courage, and the importance of standing up for what is right. He found joy in these moments, seeing the hope and determination in the faces of the next generation. He encouraged them to dream big but also to remember that every person deserves respect. Throughout this time, Charles remained humble. He did not seek praise or attention. His focus was always on the mission, to honor those who had given everything and to help build a future where no one would face the same barriers he had encountered. As months passed, the memory of that difficult day at the airport stayed with him, but it no longer weighed him down. Instead, it became a symbol of resilience and hope. Charles McGee, the black colonel who had been denied a flight while escorting a fallen soldier's remains, had turned that painful experience into a powerful force for change. His story reminded everyone that dignity and honor must be upheld, for all, no matter who they are. It showed that courage is not only found in battle, but also in standing firm against injustice. And it proved that even one person, quietly doing their duty, can inspire a whole nation to listen, learn, and grow. Charles continued to serve his country, not just in uniform, but as a leader, mentor, and advocate for fairness. His journey was far from over, but with each step, he helped move the world a little closer to justice. Colonel Charles McGee's experience of being denied boarding while escorting the remains of Private First Class Deshawn Carter had become more than just a story. It became a movement. The challenges he faced opened the eyes of many, shining a light on the unseen struggles within the military and society at large. But for Charles, the real impact was not in the headlines or social media posts. It was in the deeper changes that slowly began to take shape, and the lessons he could pass on to others. After the initial wave of attention died down, Charles kept working quietly but determinedly. He stayed involved with veterans groups, civil rights organizations, and community leaders. His goal was clear: to ensure that no soldier, black or otherwise, would face the kind of disrespect and denial he had experienced. He believed strongly that honoring those who serve was not just a ceremony, but a commitment to fairness and equality. One of the first things Charles did was to speak openly about the need for better training and awareness among airline and airport staff. He understood that many employees were simply unaware of how their actions could hurt people, especially veterans in uniform. Charles spoke at workshops and conferences, sharing his story and encouraging empathy. He emphasized that respect for service members must be part of every company's culture, especially in industries that interact directly with the public. His message was powerful because it came from experience. Charles described the quiet strength required to wear the uniform every day, knowing that some would judge or ignore you based on race instead of merit. He talked about the importance of seeing people for who they truly are: their character, their service, their sacrifice, not just skin color. Meanwhile, changes began happening inside the military. Leaders recognized that racial bias was an issue that could not be ignored. New programs were launched to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. Soldiers were encouraged to speak out about their experiences. Charles became a mentor to younger officers, especially those who faced similar challenges. His presence and support helped many find confidence and hope. In addition to advocacy, Charles also focused on personal healing and growth. He had carried the burden of discrimination for many years, but now he found ways to turn pain into purpose. He started writing a memoir to share his life's journey, from his early days in the Air Force to this moment of public recognition. Through writing, he processed his feelings and created a record of his experiences for future generations. The book became more than a story. It was a call to action. Readers were inspired by Charles's courage, his dedication to service, and his unwavering belief in justice. Schools and libraries invited him to speak about the book, and young people learned not only about history, but also about standing up for what is right. At home, Charles found joy in the simple moments. He spent time with his family, who had supported him through the difficult times. They shared laughter and memories, grounding him and reminding him of what mattered most. The bond between Charles and Deshawn's family remained strong. They continued to honor Deshawn's memory through community events, scholarships, and acts of kindness. Charles felt proud to be part of that legacy. As the years passed, the airline company that had denied Charles boarding also made meaningful changes. They improved training programs, hired diversity officers, and worked to create a more welcoming environment for all travelers. While the company could never undo the pain caused, their actions showed a commitment to learning and growing. Charles often reflected on the journey. He realized that while the denial at the airport had been a painful moment, it had also been a turning point. It sparked conversations, challenged assumptions, and led to real progress. He believed that sharing stories like his was essential to building a better future, one where respect and dignity were given freely, not earned through struggle. One of the most powerful moments came when Charles was invited to speak before a large gathering of military leaders and government officials. Standing on the stage, he looked out at the audience, many of whom had the power to shape policies and culture. He spoke from the heart about the importance of recognizing every service member's worth, of creating systems that support equality, and of the ongoing need to listen and learn. His speech was met with applause, but Charles knew the work was far from over. True change required constant effort, courage to face difficult truths, and the willingness to act. He encouraged everyone to remember that the fight for fairness was not just about policies, but about treating each person with kindness and respect every day. In his later years, Charles continued to be a symbol of hope and resilience. His story was taught in schools, shared in communities, and remembered in military history. He inspired many to serve with honor and to stand up against injustice. Through it all, Charles remained humble. He never saw himself as a hero, but as someone who did what was right in difficult times. His life showed that even when faced with rejection and unfairness, it was possible to respond with dignity and to create lasting change. The journey of Colonel Charles McGee, the Black Colonel, denied boarding while escorting a fallen soldier's remains, reminded the world of the true meaning of service, sacrifice, and courage. It taught that honor is not just about medals or ceremonies, but about the respect we show each other as human beings. And it proved that one person's quiet strength can inspire a nation to move toward justice and equality. Charles's legacy lives on in the hearts of those who believe in fairness and in the ongoing efforts to build a world where every soldier, every citizen, is valued and honored for who they are. His story is a beacon, a reminder that no matter the obstacles, dignity and respect must never be denied.